A judge looked down from the bench and said coldly, "You will stand when addressing this court, or you'll be held in contempt." The room went silent. And then, slowly, painfully, a disabled royal guard rose to his feet, one hand clutching his cane, the other shaking from the effort. And what he said next brought the entire courtroom to tears. So what exactly were his words that silenced a judge and moved hardened court officers to openly weep? Before we reveal that powerful moment, hit the subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "You will stand when addressing this bench, or you'll be held in contempt." The morning mist clung to Westminster like old memories, seeping through the ancient stones and settling in the corners where history accumulated like dust. Inside the magistrate's court, the fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, a low, persistent drone that had become the soundtrack to British justice. It was just past 8 o'clock, that quiet hour when the building held its breath, preparing itself for another day of small dramas and smaller victories. The corridors smelled of old wood polish and nervous sweat, of decades of human anxiety absorbed into institutional walls. Footsteps echoed differently here than they did on parade grounds, softer, more uncertain, lacking the rhythmic precision of military bearing. Sergeant Nathaniel stood outside Courtroom 2 like a statue that had wandered away from its pedestal. 26 years in the Coldstream Guards had taught him to find stillness in chaos, but today felt different. The building seemed to respect his silence, court clerks unconsciously lowering their voices as they passed, security guards straightening slightly when they caught sight of the scarlet tunic. Today, the red felt heavier. Not the fabric, that was the same lightweight wool that had been regulation for decades, but the weight of what it represented. The medals on his chest caught the harsh fluorescent light differently, each one a small story of service that most people would never understand. The Long Service and Good Conduct Medal, earned through years of standing motionless in all weather. The Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, commemorating not just a monarch's reign, but his own dedication to duty. And there, slightly apart from the others, the Palace Gallantry Citation, a decoration that came with memories he'd rather not revisit. The walking stick in his right hand was polished mahogany with a silver top, elegant in its simplicity. It had been a gift from his regiment when he'd refused medical discharge, a gesture of respect that meant more than any formal ceremony. The wood was warm under his palm, worn smooth by daily use, a constant reminder of everything that had changed 6 years ago. He was 44, though his face carried more years than that. Not from age, but from standing. Years of standing in all weather, through ceremonies that lasted hours, vigils that stretched into dawn. Summer heat that made the bearskin feel like a furnace, winter cold that turned brass buttons into ice against his chest. Autumn rain that soaked through everything but never moved him from his post. His hair had gone grey at the temples. Not the distinguished silver of aging politicians, but the premature frost that came from stress and sleepless nights. There was a scar along his left jaw that most people never noticed, a thin line that disappeared into his collar. It wasn't from combat, though people often assumed it was. It was from childhood, from falling off his bicycle when he was 7. The same week he'd first watched the changing of the guard and decided what he wanted to be when he grew up. Some dreams, he'd learned, exact a price you can't calculate until you've already paid it. But it was the way he held himself, straight-backed despite the cane, eyes forward despite the pain, that made passing court clerks slow their steps and lower their voices. There was something in his bearing that spoke of iron will wrapped in ceremony, of a man who'd learned to carry burdens that couldn't be seen but could be felt by anyone, with sense enough to recognize real strength. The uniform was perfect, of course. Every button mirror bright, every crease knife sharp, the bearskin hat tucked under his left arm like a sleeping giant. This wasn't ceremonial dress for him. It was armour, the only armour he'd ever trusted. "Sergeant Dre?" The voice belonged to Joanna Clenn, his solicitor. Early 30s, sharp suit, sharper mind, but her eyes held the kind of concern that made him uncomfortable. She'd been assigned to his case 3 weeks ago when the whole mess started, and she still looked at him like he might break. "The accommodation papers have been filed," she said quietly. "You won't need to stand. Judge Pryor can be difficult, but the law is clear about disability provisions." Nathaniel nodded once. He'd learned not to argue with lawyers, even the well-meaning ones, especially the well-meaning ones. "Just remember," she continued, "this isn't about proving anything. It's just a witness statement. 5 minutes, then you're done." 5 minutes. He'd stood for 5 hours without moving during the Queen's funeral procession. 5 minutes should be nothing. But courtrooms weren't parade grounds, and judges weren't commanding officers. Different rules, different kind of respect required. A court officer walked past, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the corridor. When he saw Nathaniel, his expression shifted. Not hostile exactly, but puzzled, as if wondering what a museum piece was doing in his courthouse. "This isn't Buckingham Palace," the officer muttered, not quite under his breath. Nathaniel didn't react. He'd heard worse, much worse. The truth was, he shouldn't have been here at all. The incident that brought him to this hallway had happened 6 months ago on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. He'd been on ceremonial duty outside the Victoria Memorial, part of the rotating guard that maintained a visible presence during tourist season. It was one of the easier assignments, more standing than marching, tourists rather than dignitaries to manage. The weather had been crisp, the kind of October morning that made London look like a postcard. School groups were out in force, children pressed against the barriers with wide eyes and endless questions their teachers couldn't answer. He'd been watching a particular group, Year 3 students from somewhere in Surrey, their excitement infectious even to someone trained in stoicism. That's when he'd seen Marcus Webb. 19 years old, thin to the point of gauntness, jacket too large for his frame, and shoes that had seen better years. The kind of desperation that made people do stupid things was written in every line of his posture. He'd been circling the crowd for 20 minutes, looking for an opportunity that Nathaniel had recognized from experience. When Webb made his move, a clumsy grab for an elderly tourist's handbag, Nathaniel had been ready. Not to intervene physically, that wasn't protocol, but to observe, to remember, to provide the kind of witness testimony that made prosecutions stick. What he hadn't expected was the woman's scream, or the way Webb panicked and shoved her to the ground, or how she'd hit the pavement with a sickening crack that meant broken bones and hospital bills. Sometimes situations escalated beyond protocol, beyond training, beyond the careful boundaries that separated ceremonial duty from real intervention. Sometimes you had to choose between following orders and doing what was right. Nathaniel had chosen. The arrest had been clean, professional, textbook. But somewhere in the machinery of justice, someone had decided his testimony mattered more than a simple incident report. That a Royal Guard's word carried weight in ways that ordinary witnesses didn't. They were right about that, but not in the way they expected. The door to Courtroom 2 opened with a creak that seemed to echo longer than it should. Joanna touched his elbow gently, a gesture he tolerated because he understood the kindness behind it. "Ready?" she asked. Nathaniel shifted his weight, feeling the familiar ache in his right leg. The injury was 6 years old now, but some mornings it felt fresh as yesterday. A knife, wielded by a man who'd never understood what the uniform represented. A child in danger. A split-second decision that had saved a life and changed his own forever. He'd never regretted it. Even when the doctors said he'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Even when they offered medical discharge with full honours. even when standing for hours became an act of will rather than simple duty, especially then. "Ready," he said. The courtroom was smaller than people expected, and shabbier. Television made everything look grander, more dramatic. In reality, justice operated in rooms with worn carpet that had seen too many nervous shuffles, fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh, unflattering relief, wooden benches polished smooth by decades of nervous hands and family vigils. The walls were institutional beige, broken only by faded portraits of judges long dead and a royal coat of arms that looked like it had been painted sometime during the Wilson administration. Nathaniel walked slowly down the centre aisle, the cane tapping softly against the floor with metronomic precision. Every third step barely audible to most ears, but somehow the sound carried through the courtroom's expectant silence. Conversations quieted as he passed, not dramatically, not with gasps or pointing, but with the subtle shift in atmosphere that happens when something unusual enters a familiar space. A few people turned to stare, not rudely, but with the kind of curiosity reserved for things rarely seen up close. An elderly woman in the third row whispered to her companion, "Is that a real guardsman?" A young journalist in the press section stopped scrolling through his phone and actually looked up, pen suddenly appearing in his hand as if by magic. The witness box was positioned to the right of the judge's bench, a simple wooden enclosure that had probably been built when Victoria was still on the throne. The chair inside looked like it belonged in a primary school, plastic and chrome, utterly at odds with the formal setting. Nathaniel took his seat carefully, adjusting his position so the cane could rest against his leg without falling. The bearskin went on the small table beside him, a furry reminder of ceremonies and state occasions that felt very far away from this institutional grey room. The weight of it surprised him, not the physical weight, which he'd carried thousands of times, but the emotional weight of setting it down. For 26 years, that hat had been part of his identity. Removing it, even temporarily, felt like taking off armour before battle. Joanna settled at the solicitor's table with the nervous precision of someone who'd learned that details mattered in rooms like this. She arranged her papers twice, checked her watch, smoothed her skirt. Around them, the courtroom filled with the usual cast of characters. Court reporters with their silent keyboards, legal clerks clutching files like shields, a handful of observers who attended hearings like other people watched soap operas, drawn by the small dramas that unfolded in the space between law and justice. The air itself felt different in courtrooms, heavier, charged with the accumulated weight of thousands of decisions, thousands of lives changed by words spoken from an elevated bench. It was atmosphere you couldn't manufacture, only accumulate through decades of human consequence. Then, the door at the back of the room opened, and everything changed. Judge Malcolm Pryor entered like weather. You felt him before you saw him. 60-something, silver hair cropped military short, shoulders that suggested he'd once worn uniform himself, though probably never the kind that required standing in the rain for hours without moving. His robes billowed slightly as he walked, creating the illusion of greater height, greater presence. But there was something in his bearing that spoke of authority unchallenged for too long, of a man who'd forgotten that respect was earned, not simply inherited with position. His eyes swept the courtroom with practiced efficiency, cataloguing faces, assessing moods, establishing dominance through sheer force of presence. It was a skill all judges developed, the ability to command attention without speaking, to establish order through expectations rather than demand. But when his gaze found Nathaniel, something shifted. A pause, barely perceptible to anyone not trained to read the subtleties of command presence. Pryor's eyes took in the uniform, the medals, the ceremonial perfection of everything except the cane leaning against the witness box. There was something in that look, not quite disapproval, not quite curiosity, but a kind of professional assessment that made Nathaniel's spine straighten involuntarily. "All rise," called the clerk, her voice cutting through the courtroom's expectant silence. The courtroom stood as one, a rustling of fabric and creaking of joints, the sound of people who spent too much time sitting, forcing themselves upright. Solicitors smoothed their robes, observers checked their phones one last time, court officers assumed positions of respectful attention, all except Nathaniel, who remained seated, head bowed slightly in acknowledgement, but feet firmly planted. It wasn't defiance. Anyone looking closely could see the careful positioning of his legs, the way his right foot turned slightly outward to accommodate the damaged nerve, the subtle tension around his eyes that spoke of pain, carefully controlled. Judge Pryor's frown was barely perceptible, a shadow passing across his features like clouds over sun. But Nathaniel caught it. 30 years of reading officers' faces had taught him to recognize disapproval in all its subtle forms, from the raised eyebrow that meant mild displeasure to the compressed lips that preceded formal reprimand. This was somewhere in between, testing waters, establishing boundaries. "Be seated," Pryor said, settling into his chair with the weight of institutional authority. The courtroom sat, the tension remained standing. "This is a continuation of sentencing in case number 247C, the judge began, consulting his notes. "We have a witness statement to be entered from—" He paused, eyes finding Nathaniel again. "Sergeant Nathaniel Dre of the Coldstream Guards." A murmur ran through the public gallery. Not dramatic, just the quiet stirring that happens when people realize they're witnessing something unusual. A Royal Guard in court wasn't exactly front-page news, but it wasn't everyday business either. Joanna rose from her seat, but before she could speak, Judge Pryor held up a hand. "Just a moment, Miss Clenn." His voice carried the kind of casual authority that made junior barristers sweat. "I have a question for the witness." Nathaniel met his gaze steadily. In the military, eye contact was respect. In courtrooms, it could be seen as challenge. The difference mattered. "Sergeant Dre," the judge said, "when this court rose to acknowledge my entrance, you remained seated. Why?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Joanna started to rise again, but Nathaniel's slight gesture kept her in place. This was his moment to answer. "Medical accommodation, Your Honor," he said simply. "Filed with the court 3 days ago." "I see." Pryor leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "And this accommodation, it prevents you from showing proper respect to this court." There it was. Not the question he'd asked, but the one he'd meant. The challenge wrapped in judicial robes and proper procedure. Nathaniel's voice didn't change pitch or volume. Military training had taught him that the loudest voice rarely won the argument. "It prevents me from standing without significant pain, Your Honor. It does not prevent me from showing respect." The judge's expression tightened. Around the courtroom, people shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how these things usually went. Witnesses were supposed to defer, to apologize, to explain themselves in terms the court could easily process. But Nathaniel Dre wasn't most witnesses. "The accommodation papers," Judge Pryor said, turning to his clerk. "Where are they?" The clerk fumbled through a stack of documents, clearly flustered. "They should be, 'Here, Your Honor, filed by Miss Clenn's office on Tuesday.'" "Should be isn't good enough," Pryor snapped. "Either they exist or they don't." Joanna stood quickly. "Your Honor, I can provide copies." "You can remain seated until I ask you to speak," the judge cut her off. His attention returned to Nathaniel. "The law requires equal respect from all present in this courtroom. Uniform or civilian, witness or defendant. Do you understand this?" "I do." "Then perhaps you can explain why your condition should exempt you from the basic courtesies we observe here." The word condition landed with deliberate weight. Not injury, not service-related disability. Condition, as if it were something Nathaniel had chosen, something he could simply decide to overcome. The courtroom had gone completely quiet. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, fingers poised over keys as if afraid to miss what came next. Nathaniel looked at the judge, really looked at him, past the robes and the bench and the authority. What he saw was a man who'd never had his strength tested, never been asked to stand when standing meant agony, never had to choose between dignity and duty. 6 years ago, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, I was on ceremonial duty outside the palace gates. A man with a knife tried to reach the barriers where a group of school children were watching the changing of the guard. He paused, not for effect, but because some memories demanded their own space. I stopped him. In the process, the knife went through my hip and severed the nerve that controls my right leg. The children were safe. The man was arrested. I spent 4 months learning to walk again. Judge Pryor's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. When the doctors offered medical discharge, Nathaniel continued, I asked to remain on active duty, not because I couldn't accept my limitations, but because I believed service meant more than perfect posture. The silence stretched taut as a drum skin. I have stood for 26 years, Your Honour. Through rain and snow and blazing heat, I've stood while protesters screamed at me, while tourists tried to make me flinch, while children counted how long I could go without blinking. I have stood at state funerals and royal weddings, at ceremonies for the living and vigils for the dead. His voice never rose, never hardened. It simply carried the weight of absolute truth. I stand because it's my duty. I sit because it's my necessity. And if this court cannot tell the difference between disrespect and disability, then perhaps it needs to examine what respect actually means. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. In the public gallery, an elderly woman pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. A young man in the press section had stopped taking notes entirely, pen forgotten in his hand. Judge Pryor stared at Nathaniel for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. The accommodation papers? The clerk found them immediately this time, as if they'd been there all along. Here, Your Honour, medical certification attached. Pryor scanned the documents quickly, his frown deepening with each line. When he finished, he set them aside and leaned forward slightly. Sergeant Dre, he said, this court acknowledges your service and your sacrifice. It wasn't an apology, judges didn't apologize, but it was recognition, and in its restraint, it carried more weight than flowery speeches. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly. Thank you, Your Honour. The formal business of the hearing continued. The witness statement was entered without incident, a simple account of what Nathaniel had observed 6 months ago. The defendant, a 19-year-old named Marcus Webb, who'd stolen the handbag in a moment of desperation, received a suspended sentence and community service. Justice served with appropriate measure. But the real verdict had already been delivered. As the session concluded and the judge prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. It started with the court officer who'd made the snide comment earlier. He stood as Judge Pryor rose, but instead of the usual perfunctory attention, he came to something approaching military bearing, straight back, shoulders square, eyes forward. Others followed. The clerk, the stenographer, people in the public gallery. Not everyone. Some were simply confused by the atmosphere, but enough to change the texture of the moment. It wasn't applause, it wasn't ceremony, it was simply recognition. The kind that happens when people realize they've witnessed something authentic in a world full of performance. Judge Pryor noticed. How could he not? He paused at the door to his chambers, looking back at the courtroom that had somehow transformed itself from a place of business into something approaching reverence. His eyes found Nathaniel once more. The guard was rising slowly from his seat, using the cane for support, but not leaning on it. Every movement deliberate, controlled, dignified, despite the obvious difficulty. Sergeant, Pryor said quietly. Nathaniel looked up. Thank you for your service, all of it. This time it was This time it was personal, not judicial courtesy or professional recognition, but one man acknowledging another. Nathaniel nodded once. "It was my honour, Your Honour." The judge left through his private door. The courtroom began to empty with the usual shuffle of papers and quiet conversations. But the atmosphere remained changed, charged with something that couldn't be written into court records or reduced to legal precedent. As Nathaniel made his way toward the exit, moving slowly but steadily, he became aware of someone walking beside him. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, holding his mother's hand but looking up at the guard with undisguised fascination. "Mum," the boy whispered, not very quietly, "is he a real soldier?" The mother looked embarrassed, but Nathaniel stopped walking. He looked down at the child, really looked at him, the way adults rarely do with children. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." "Do you guard the Queen?" "I guard what she represents," Nathaniel replied. "Tradition. History. The idea that some things are worth protecting." The boy considered this with the seriousness children bring to important questions. "Does it hurt?" he asked, nodding at the cane. "Sometimes," Nathaniel said, "but not as much as not serving would hurt." The mother started to apologize for her son's questions, but Nathaniel waved her concern away. Children's honesty was refreshing after a morning of legal circumlocution. "Can I shake your hand?" the boy asked. Nathaniel smiled, the first real smile anyone had seen from him all day. He offered his hand and the boy shook it with the exaggerated formality children use when they're trying to be grown up. "Thank you for your service," the boy said, clearly repeating something he'd heard adults say. "Thank you for your questions," Nathaniel replied. "They were better than the ones I got in there." Outside the courthouse, London was doing what London does, carrying on with the relentless business of being one of the world's great cities. Traffic flowed in its eternal patterns. Pedestrians hurried along pavements worn smooth by millions of footsteps. Street vendors called out their offerings to anyone who would listen. The city's rhythm continued unchanged, indifferent to the small drama that had played out in Courtroom 2. But for those who'd been inside that morning, something fundamental had shifted. Nathaniel stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settling on his shoulders like an old coat. The October air was crisp, but not cold, carrying hints of autumn that made the light seem different, more precious somehow. The uniform that had felt so heavy walking in now felt lighter, not because the fabric had changed, but because it had been seen, really seen, understood for what it represented rather than judged for what it appeared to be. The morning's confrontation had cost him something. Not just the physical effort of standing when standing hurt, but the emotional energy required to make himself vulnerable in front of strangers, to transform private pain into public testimony. But it had also given him something back. Recognition that what he'd chosen to do with his life mattered beyond parades and ceremonies, beyond the tourist photographs and the careful choreography of state occasions. A black cab approached the curb, its orange light glowing like a small beacon of salvation. Not summoned. London taxis had a way of appearing when you needed them most, as if the city itself provided for those who'd given it something worth preserving. Nathaniel climbed in carefully, settling the cane beside him and giving the driver an address in Chelsea. The route would take them past some of the places he'd stood guard over the years: Buckingham Palace, St. James's, the Mall, where tourists gathered to watch ceremonies that connected them to something larger than their daily lives. As the taxi pulled away from Westminster, he caught a glimpse of himself in the window reflection. Still in uniform, still carrying the visible signs of service and sacrifice. But something in his expression had changed during the morning's ordeal. The weight was still there, it always would be, but it was balanced now by something that had been missing for too long: understanding. Not just from others, but from himself. For 6 years, since the knife had changed everything, he'd carried a quiet burden of doubt. Not about his decision to intervene. That had been instinctive, necessary, right in ways that transcended rules and procedures. But about what came after. about whether choosing to remain in service despite his limitations was pride or duty, stubbornness or dedication. The morning's events had answered that question in ways he hadn't expected. Standing in that courtroom, forcing himself upright despite the pain, speaking truths that most people preferred to leave unexamined, that hadn't been about proving himself to skeptical judges or curious observers. It had been about proving something to himself. That service wasn't about perfection. That dignity wasn't about never showing weakness. That sometimes the most profound respect came not from flawless execution of duty, but from the willingness to continue serving, even when service became difficult, even when it required acknowledging your limitations while refusing to be limited by them. The taxi merged into the flow of London traffic, passing double-decker buses filled with tourists, pointing cameras at everything they saw, black cabs carrying business people to meetings they'd probably forgotten by dinner, delivery trucks bringing the necessities of modern life to ancient streets. All of it part of the great machine that kept the city running, kept the world moving forward, whether individuals were ready or not. But tradition moved at a different pace. Tradition was about continuity, about maintaining connections to something larger and older and more tested than the immediate demands of contemporary life. It was about standing guard, literally and figuratively, over values that needed protecting precisely because they were no longer fashionable to protect. The cityscape flowing past the taxi windows told the story of that tension. Ancient churches stood beside gleaming office towers. Narrow medieval streets carried modern traffic. Horse Guards parade, where he'd stood countless times in perfect formation, sat in the shadow of buildings that hadn't existed when the first guards took their posts centuries ago. All of it connected, all of it necessary. The old and the new, the ceremonial and the practical, the symbolic and the real. As they approached Chelsea, passing the shops and cafes where off-duty guardsmen sometimes gathered for quiet pints and quieter conversations, Nathaniel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Not pride exactly, that would have been inappropriate, somehow diminishing to what he'd experienced, but satisfaction at having represented something larger than himself with dignity, at having stood for the idea that some duties transcended personal comfort or convenience. The taxi pulled up to his building, a modest Victorian conversion that housed several other service members and their families. Nothing grand or imposing, just solid brick and decent maintenance, the kind of place where people who'd devoted their lives to something beyond personal gain could afford to live with quiet dignity. He paid the driver and climbed out carefully, the familiar ache in his right leg, reminding him that the morning's exertion would have consequences. But that was tomorrow's concern. Today had been about standing when standing mattered, about speaking when silence would have been easier, about representing not just himself, but the idea that service, real service, continued even when the spotlight faded and the applause ended. Inside his flat, the afternoon light filtered through windows that looked out onto a small garden where other residents sometimes gathered for impromptu barbecues or quiet conversations. The space was neat without being sterile, comfortable without being luxurious. Military efficiency softened by personal touches that spoke of a life lived with purpose beyond the requirements of duty. He hung his uniform carefully, each piece treated with the respect due to symbols that had served longer than any individual who wore them. The medals went into their proper case, not hidden away, but preserved for the next time duty called. The bearskin found its stand in the corner where it waited between ceremonies, patient and eternal as the traditions it represented. The walking stick leaned against the wall beside the door where it belonged, not hidden away like an embarrassment, but acknowledged as part of the equipment that enabled service rather than prevented it. Later, he would write his report on the morning's proceedings, the kind of detailed account that military bureaucracy required, and that served as historical record for those who came after. But the real record of what had happened in Courtroom 2 wouldn't be found in official documents. It would be carried in the memories of everyone who'd witnessed it, the judge who'd learned something about the nature of respect, The observers who'd seen strength expressed through vulnerability, the child who'd shaken hands with someone who embodied the idea that duty could be both burden and privilege. Most of all, it would be carried in Nathaniel's own understanding of what it meant to serve not just when service was easy, but when it required everything you had to give and more than you thought you could manage. Some battles, he reflected, as the London afternoon settled into early evening, weren't fought with weapons or tactics or dramatic gestures. They were fought with patience, with dignity, with the simple refusal to yield ground that shouldn't be yielded. In Courtroom 2 that morning, wearing the uniform he'd earned through decades of service and sacrifice, he'd fought that kind of battle. And in his quiet way, representing not just himself, but everyone who'd ever stood guard over something worth preserving, he'd won. Have you ever been asked to prove your worth in the wrong way? When standing up meant more than staying down, even when it hurt? If this story showed you what real dignity looks like under pressure, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss our daily stories of honor in action. Ring that bell for notifications, and if you know someone who thinks military ceremony is just for show, share this with them. They might see something they never noticed before. Our next story is already queued up on your screen, another moment when quiet strength spoke louder than words ever could. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another reminder that the deepest respect isn't demanded, it's earned, one silent stand at a time.